Greeting once again, Gentleman Jim here. Now I'm talking about the Apollo, I'm talking about me working, my high school, giving you guys a little heads up on a lot of things. But let me tell you a few things about the Apollo Theater that you might or might not know. Now, the Apollo Theater originally was a burlesque theater before it became the Apollo. It was called at that particular time Heritage and Seamen's Music Hall. That's what it was called back then. Now, Frank Schiffman and Leo Beecher bought it. And in 1934, they changed the name to the Apollo Theater. Now, we got to remember that. Now, by this time now, Harlem had made a big transformation in who lived there, opposed to who used to live there. Like I said, it was founded by the Jewish community and the Italian, the Irish community way back when. But it was after 1920 that Harlem was overran by blacks and the so-called Harlem Renaissance. So now we have a theater in Harlem where the black entertainers could perform. And that became the Apollo Theater in 1934. Now, back in my day when I got to Harlem, like I say, the Apollo Theater had different type of headliners than they had later on when I went back there to work in the 60s. This was in the 50s now. And they had more of the, what we really call rock and roll, opposed to rhythm and blues. Now back then they had the Cadillacs, they had the Coasters, they had the Drifters, they had Lee Andrews and the Hearts. Let's see what other groups that they have that you guys might remember the names now. They had a lot of those. And then they had a guy, like I said, named Jocko. That was Jocko Henderson. And Jocko Henderson, let's see what his real name, his full name was Doug Jocko Henderson. And like I said, he had the shows, he had more shows back then, and he's the one who created that silver space suit, because it was Jocko's Rocket Ship Review, and he'd come out the rafters in a spaceship hanging on wires, and the smoke be billowing. Well, that was during the 50s and into the early 60s when Jocko's Rocket Ship was really, really big. Then as the 60s moved on is when we got into more of the rhythm and blues opposed to the rock and roll. You know, rock and roll you had, like I said, you had Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. You had the ones who sang 16 Candles. Those were the big songs back then. When the 60s came around, it changed. Well, now, what was the makeup of the Apollo Theater? Well, in the 50s, when I first knew of the Apollo Theater, I didn't know the makeup. But in the 60s, when I went to work on 125th Street, I did know the makeup. Like I say, at that particular time now, remember it changed names in 34. So this is 20 years later. And by then, Frank Schiffman owned the Apollo Theater. His son Bob Schiffman ran the day-to-day operations. Now, how do I know this? It's because they too were clients of Ori Walls, Ori's Custom Tailoring. And I spent time sitting in the office, because I could always go in and out of the Apollo Theater back then, with no problems asked, no questions asked, or anything. And the Apollo Theater was mainly having the rotation of the black shows come through. They also had the Jewel Box Review come through. I'll tell you guys about that later on. But that's what it was. At that particular time, you had a gentleman named Neil. And Neil was the Apollo manager. And Neil was a very unique guy. He was sharp, always sharp, stayed sharp. But Neil had lost his arm for whatever reason. I never asked him, was none of my business. So we made a lot of suits for Neil back then too. But Neil would have that one sleeve where he didn't have an arm. I can't remember which arm it was either. But it was always pinned up. But Neil was always clean. Oh, he was always clean. He was like the manager of the Apollo Theater. Then you had a gentleman named Honey Cole. Now, Honey Cole used to be a big-time dancer back in his day. And Honey was like the stage manager. He kind of handled booking the acts and bringing them in if they weren't an act that brought the whole everything in. You had a guy who was the house comedian back then, and his name was Sad Sam. And he was like an MC type guy who he would bring the shows on, keep the Apollo Theater crowd up in arms with his jokes and whatnot. These were the Apollo people, see? They never get mentioned in it, and then you always had, who? Sandman Sims. We used to call him the Harlem Sandman, but Sandman Sims was the gentleman who would come out with the big hook, and if you got booed off during the amateur show, that was usually on Wednesday nights, he'd hook you with his big hook and snatch you off the stage. Well, at one time he was a big-time dancer, a big-time tap dancer, but he now had the job as that, and they called him Sandman. Well, we call him the Harlem Sandman. It's a funny thing, back in the day, whenever something went down, there was always a fire. So whenever we saw Sandman, we said, oh man, you started another fire there. But it was kind of a little community joke that went on. But with him, then like I said, the shows that ran in the Apollo ran from Friday to Thursday. A new act started every Friday, and they ended that Thursday. It was never a break in between shows. Come Thursday, after the last show, they would break that down and prepare for the Friday show. The marquee was being changed. All that went on back in the days. That's what kind of ran the Apollo Theater. And that's how it was ran, and that's who ran it and who was in place back then. Like I say, I wrote a book about my time when I was there called Across 125th Street, and I subtitled it When the Magic Was Real. And people used to always ask me in the beginning, why did you call it When the Magic Was Real? But like I said, during this time on 125th Street in the Apollo Theater, Harlem, Heartbeat Apollo Theater was magical. You saw people, you saw the players hanging out, you saw the pimps and the hustlers, you saw the everyday people coming and going all the time, and it was a air and an aura over Harlem. That it was just exciting back then. But it all stemmed around the Apollo Theater, because like I said, that was the heartbeat of Harlem back then, because it was like the drawing point that brought people from all over to the Apollo Theater to see who was performing. Because if you lived in New York back then, you could always see these top acts that were on the radio, the R&B charts, the rhythm and blues charts. We heard them on our radio stations. We had WWRL, which was an AM station back in the days, and later on they added a FM station, WBLS. Well, these were the catalysts for our music back then. But WWRL was right there in Harlem, right on Lenox Avenue. WWRL, it was right there. You had the Amsterdam newspaper. That too was right there in Harlem. So we had these things going on for us back then. Now we got the other radio stations, because I mean, music is music and radio is radio, but they were kind of the Harlem radio stations, but they mainly centered around the Apollo Theater, because that was the drawing point, and that drew all these people to Harlem back in the day. But the Schiffmans owned it. Frank Schiffman, father, Bob Schiffman, son. Honey Cole was one of the managers, and Sad Sam, Sandman Sims. You know, he was the guy who hooked him out, wore the little funny color pants and whatnot. And he had Neil, the one-armed brother. You would see them all the time. So they were a fixture at the Apollo Theater. And I don't know if anybody's ever written about them or done a bio on them and their lives. That I don't know. All I know is that I pay respect to those people who were there. Now you're going to learn about a lot more people as this series goes on that were main fixtures in Harlem back in the day. So, once again, James Lee McFarland, the brother from Harlem, with the high school education. And as I say, now we're in Harlem doing Harlem things around the Apollo Theater. So, until we meet again, my friends, I'm signing off, but I'll be back.